Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we're exploring the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, a brutal conflict fought in some of the coldest conditions of World War II. When the Soviet Union invaded Finland, few believed the smaller nation could survive. Yet against overwhelming odds, Finland resisted. How did they do it, and what lessons did this war leave behind? Let's take a closer look. In 1939, Europe stood on the edge of a conflict unlike any it had known before. Political tension, unresolved grievances from the First World War, and competing ideologies had created an unstable balance of power. While global attention focused on Germany's actions in Central Europe, another confrontation was quietly forming in the north. Finland, a small nation bordering the Soviet Union, occupied a strategically sensitive position. Having gained independence from Russia in 1917, Finland remained wary of its powerful eastern neighbor. Its long border with the Soviet Union stretched across forests, lakes, and sparsely populated regions, making defense difficult but also offering natural obstacles. For the Soviet leadership, security concerns dominated strategic thinking. Leningrad, one of the Soviet Union's most important cities, lay dangerously close to the Finnish border. Soviet planners viewed this proximity as a vulnerability, particularly in the context of an increasingly unstable Europe. In August 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact reshaped the political landscape. The agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Finland fell within the Soviet sphere. This diplomatic arrangement would soon have direct consequences. As war erupted in Poland and spread across Europe, Finland attempted to maintain neutrality. The Finnish government understood the dangers of provocation and sought to avoid entanglement in great power conflict. However, neutrality offered little protection when strategic interests collided. The Soviet Union began pressing Finland for territorial concessions. Soviet officials argued that border adjustments were necessary to protect Leningrad. Finnish leaders viewed these demands as a threat to sovereignty. Negotiations grew tense, marked by mutual distrust. Public opinion in Finland hardened. Memories of Russian rule were still fresh, and national identity was closely tied to independence. Concessions were widely seen as a first step toward domination. Diplomatic efforts failed to produce agreement. By late 1939, the situation had deteriorated beyond compromise. Military preparations intensified on both sides of the border. While much of Europe watched events in the west, the north prepared for war. Finland, vastly outnumbered and outgunned, faced the prospect of confronting one of the world's largest military powers. What followed would challenge assumptions about modern warfare, expose weaknesses in military doctrine, and become one of the most remarkable defensive struggles of the Second World War. The stage was set, winter was approaching, and war was about to arrive in the frozen forests of Finland. In the months leading up to the Winter War, the relationship between Finland and the Soviet Union was defined by deep mistrust and incompatible security priorities. Although Finland had maintained formal neutrality since gaining independence in 1917, its geographic position made it impossible to escape the strategic calculations of its eastern neighbor. For the Soviet Union, the primary concern was the defense of Leningrad. The city lay less than 40 kilometers from the Finnish border, a distance Soviet military planners considered dangerously small. In an era when artillery range and air power were expanding rapidly, this proximity was viewed as an unacceptable risk. Soviet leadership believed that hostile forces could potentially use Finnish territory as a staging ground against one of the Soviet Union's most vital industrial and political centers. In 1938 and 1939, Soviet diplomats began approaching Finland with proposals aimed at altering the border. These demands included the cession of territory on the Karelian Isthmus, control over islands in the Gulf of Finland, and the leasing of a naval base at Hanko. In exchange, the Soviet Union offered larger areas of sparsely populated land in eastern Karelia. From the Soviet perspective, these demands were framed as defensive and reasonable. Officials insisted that the proposed changes would not threaten Finnish independence. They emphasized mutual security and claimed that similar arrangements had been accepted by other neighboring states. Finland viewed the situation very differently. The territories demanded by the Soviet Union included some of the country's most heavily fortified defensive positions, particularly along the Karelian Isthmus. These areas formed the backbone of Finland's national defense strategy. Relinquishing them would leave the country exposed. Finnish leaders also doubted Soviet assurances. Recent events in Eastern Europe demonstrated how quickly influence could turn into domination. The fate of the Baltic states, which had accepted Soviet military bases under similar agreements, served as a warning. Many Finns believed that accepting Soviet demands would inevitably lead to loss of sovereignty. Negotiations were conducted in Moscow under tense conditions. Finnish representatives sought compromise, offering limited concessions while attempting to preserve core defensive positions. The Soviet delegation remained firm, pressing for substantial territorial changes. Public opinion in Finland strongly opposed any surrender of land. The Finnish press closely followed developments, and nationalist sentiment intensified. Political leaders were under immense pressure to resist Soviet demands, even at the risk of war. Internally, Finland faced difficult choices. Militarily, the country was unprepared for prolonged conflict with the Soviet Union. Its army was small, equipment was limited, and resources were scarce. Diplomatically, Finland lacked powerful allies willing to offer immediate military support. Despite these challenges, the Finnish government concluded that compliance would undermine national survival. The decision to resist was rooted in the belief that sovereignty, once compromised, could not be regained. By November 1939, negotiations had reached an impasse. Soviet leadership accused Finland of hostility and began preparing military options. Propaganda efforts intensified, portraying Finland as a threat to Soviet security. On November 26, 1939, a border incident occurred near the village of Mainila. Soviet artillery shells exploded on Soviet territory, killing several soldiers. The Soviet Union accused Finland of launching the attack. Finland denied responsibility and proposed a joint investigation. The proposal was rejected. The Mainila incident provided the Soviet Union with a pretext for action. Diplomatic relations deteriorated rapidly. The Soviet Union withdrew from the non-aggression pact with Finland, effectively clearing the path to war. In Finland, mobilization accelerated. Reservists were called up, defensive positions were reinforced, and preparations were made for an invasion many believed was inevitable. Winter conditions worsened, with temperatures dropping and snow covering the landscape. On the diplomatic front, Finland appealed to the international community. However, responses were limited to expressions of concern. The country stood largely alone. The failure of negotiations marked the final step toward armed conflict. What had begun as diplomatic pressure now moved toward military confrontation. The demands had been made. They had been rejected, and the border between diplomacy and war was about to disappear. In the early hours of November 30th, 1939, Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border along multiple fronts. Without a formal declaration of war, the Red Army launched a full-scale invasion of Finland. Artillery barrages struck border positions, and Soviet aircraft bombed Finnish cities, including Helsinki. The Winter War had begun. The Soviet strategy relied on overwhelming force. Soviet planners expected a short campaign, assuming that numerical superiority and mechanized units would quickly break Finnish resistance. The Red Army fielded hundreds of thousands of troops, supported by tanks, artillery, and air power. Finland, by contrast, mobilized a far smaller force with limited equipment and minimal armored support. Initial Soviet advances targeted the Karelian Isthmus, the most direct route to Helsinki. This region was heavily fortified by Finnish defenses collectively known as the Mannerheim Line. Elsewhere, Soviet troops advanced through forested and sparsely populated regions, aiming to split Finland and secure key transportation routes. Finnish defenses responded with rapid mobilization. Reservists moved into position despite harsh weather conditions. Communication lines were stretched, and supply shortages were immediate. Yet morale among Finnish troops remained high, fueled by a strong sense of national unity. Air raids on Finnish cities caused civilian casualties and damage, but they failed to break public resolve. The bombings instead strengthened Finnish resistance and drew international attention. The League of Nations condemned the Soviet attack, eventually expelling the Soviet Union from the organization. On the ground, Soviet troops encountered unexpected challenges. The terrain favored defenders familiar with the environment. Dense forests, frozen lakes, and limited road networks hindered mechanized movement. Soviet columns were often confined to narrow roads, making them vulnerable to ambush. Finnish units employed flexible tactics. Small, mobile groups operated independently, exploiting their knowledge of the terrain. They avoided direct confrontation with larger Soviet formations, instead targeting supply lines and isolated units. Winter conditions quickly became a decisive factor. Temperatures dropped well below freezing, sometimes reaching extreme lows. Soviet troops, poorly equipped for winter warfare, suffered from frostbite and exposure. Vehicles failed, weapons malfunctioned, and logistical support faltered. Despite initial setbacks, Soviet forces continued to push forward. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the imbalance in numbers remained significant. Soviet commanders adjusted tactics, increasing artillery use and attempting to overwhelm Finnish positions through sheer force. Finnish resistance slowed the advance but could not stop it entirely. Defensive lines held in some areas while collapsing in others. Each engagement tested the limits of Finland's manpower and resources. International reaction was mixed. Sympathy for Finland was widespread, and volunteers arrived from several countries. Material aid was promised, though delivery was slow and limited. Finland remained largely isolated. The opening phase of the Winter War shattered assumptions on both sides. The Soviet Union realized the campaign would not be brief. Finland understood the scale of the threat it faced. The invasion had begun with confidence. It quickly became a struggle against terrain, weather, and determination. The war would not be decided by numbers alone. As the Winter War progressed into December 1939, the character of the conflict became increasingly defined by Finland's landscape and climate. Vast forests, frozen lakes, and narrow roads shaped every engagement. What Soviet planners had anticipated as a rapid mechanized campaign turned into a prolonged struggle against an environment for which they were unprepared. Finnish forces adapted quickly to these conditions. Most Finnish soldiers were accustomed to winter survival, skiing, and operating in sub-zero temperatures. White camouflage uniforms allowed them to blend seamlessly into snow-covered terrain. Mobility, rather than firepower, became their primary advantage. Small Finnish units used skis to move rapidly through forests, often bypassing roads entirely. This allowed them to strike unexpectedly and disappear before Soviet forces could respond. These tactics neutralized the numerical superiority of the Red Army by preventing large-scale engagements. One of the most effective Finnish methods was the use of Motti tactics. Soviet columns advancing along forest roads were cut into isolated segments, Mottis, by attacks on supply lines and communication routes. Once encircled, these pockets were systematically reduced through harassment, ambushes, and attrition. Soviet units, heavily reliant on roads, struggled to adapt. Tanks and trucks became trapped or immobilized by snow and cold. Fuel froze, engines failed, and maintenance became nearly impossible. Infantry units often lacked adequate winter clothing, leading to severe frostbite and exposure-related casualties. The forests themselves became weapons. Finnish soldiers used the terrain to conceal movements and stage surprise attacks. Silence, discipline, and local knowledge allowed them to strike at vulnerable points. Field kitchens, ammunition depots, and command posts. Combat conditions were brutal. Temperatures frequently dropped below -30 degrees Celsius. Weapons malfunctioned, metal froze to bare skin, and prolonged exposure was life-threatening. Survival required constant movement and careful management of resources. Finnish morale remained high despite shortages. The defense of the homeland fostered a sense of shared purpose. Civilians supported the war effort by providing supplies, intelligence, and shelter. The entire society became involved in resistance. Soviet commanders faced mounting challenges. Losses were heavy, and initial assumptions about Finnish collapse proved false. Attempts to deploy mass infantry assaults often resulted in devastating casualties, as troops advanced through open snowfields under Finnish fire. Adaptation was slow. Soviet doctrine emphasized centralized control and large formations, ill-suited to fragmented forest warfare. Communication failures further hampered coordination, leading to confusion and vulnerability. Yet the Red Army persisted. Reinforcements arrived, and tactics gradually evolved. Artillery support increased, and efforts were made to improve winter equipment and training. Still, progress remained costly. The frozen forests of Finland transformed warfare into a test of endurance and ingenuity. Technology mattered less than adaptability. Numbers mattered less than knowledge of terrain. These battles, fought far from major cities, defined the Winter War's early months. They demonstrated how a smaller force could resist a larger one by exploiting environment and tactics. The forest did not favor speed or power. They rewarded patience, precision, and familiarity. In the silence of snow-covered woods, the war took on its most distinctive form. While much of the Winter War was fought in forests and remote regions, the strategic heart of the conflict lay along the Karelian Isthmus. This narrow stretch of land between the Gulf of Finland and Lake Ladoga formed the most direct route to Helsinki. Protecting it was essential for Finland's survival. The defensive system constructed that became known as the Mannerheim Line. Contrary to later myth, the Mannerheim Line was not a continuous wall or fortress network comparable to the Maginot Line. It consisted of a series of field fortifications, bunkers, trenches, and natural obstacles integrated into the terrain. Its strength lay not in concrete alone, but in careful placement, camouflage, and coordination with the surrounding landscape. Construction of the line began in the 1920s and continued intermittently due to limited resources. Finland lacked the industrial capacity to build massive fortresses. Instead, defenses relied on reinforced concrete bunkers, wooden structures, barbed wire, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles. Frozen lakes and forests were deliberately incorporated into the defensive plan. The line was named after Marshal Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim, Commander-in-Chief of the Finnish Armed Forces. Mannerheim understood that the defense of the isthmus would determine the war's outcome. If the line collapsed, Finland's core territory would be exposed. When Soviet forces launched their main offensive along the Karelian Isthmus, they encountered unexpectedly resilient resistance. Soviet commanders underestimated both the line's effectiveness and the determination of Finnish defenders. Early assaults relied on massed infantry attacks supported by tanks, but these tactics proved costly. Finnish troops used the terrain to maximize defensive advantage. Bunkers were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Narrow approaches forced Soviet units into predictable paths. Artillery and machine gun fire inflicted heavy casualties. Winter conditions compounded Soviet difficulties. Snow and ice hindered movement and exposed advancing troops. Tanks struggled against obstacles and anti-tank measures. Finnish soldiers used Molotov cocktails and close-range attacks to disable armored vehicles. The Red Army responded with increased firepower. Artillery bombardments intensified, and repeated assaults were launched to probe weaknesses. Casualties mounted on both sides, but the Finnish line held. For weeks, the Mannerheim Line resisted Soviet pressure. Each failed assault undermined Soviet morale and challenged assumptions about the Red Army's capabilities. International observers noted the unexpected effectiveness of Finnish defenses. However, the imbalance of resources gradually became apparent. Soviet forces adapted their tactics, improved coordination, and brought overwhelming artillery to bear. Continuous bombardment began to degrade Finnish positions. By February 1940, Soviet breakthroughs occurred at key points along the line. Finnish defenders, exhausted and short of ammunition, were forced to retreat to secondary positions. The line, though not completely destroyed, was no longer sustainable. The battle for the Mannerheim Line marked a turning point. It demonstrated Finland's capacity for resistance, but also revealed the limits imposed by manpower and material shortages. The line had delayed the Soviet advance far longer than expected. It bought Finland valuable time and international sympathy. Yet time alone could not alter the strategic balance. The Mannerheim Line did not fall easily. It yielded only after exacting a heavy price. Its defense became a symbol of Finland's resolve. As the Winter War entered its later stages, the Soviet Union was forced to confront the reality of its losses. The initial campaign, envisioned as a swift and decisive operation, had instead become a costly and humiliating struggle. Casualties mounted at a rate far exceeding expectations, and the Red Army's performance drew scrutiny both domestically and internationally. Early Soviet tactics had relied on numerical superiority and mechanized force. These methods proved ineffective in Finland's terrain and climate. Massed infantry assaults, poorly coordinated armor, and rigid command structures resulted in devastating losses. Entire units were encircled, isolated, and destroyed in forest engagements. Estimates of Soviet casualties varied, but even conservative figures indicated tens of thousands killed or wounded within weeks. Frostbite and exposure compounded combat losses. Medical evacuation was hampered by weather and distance, increasing mortality among the injured. These setbacks triggered internal reassessment within the Soviet military leadership. Commanders recognized the need to adapt tactics, improve logistics, and address deficiencies in training and equipment. The Winter War exposed systemic weaknesses in the Red Army that had gone unacknowledged. One significant change involved leadership. Several commanders were replaced, and operational control was reorganized. Greater emphasis was placed on coordination between infantry, artillery, and armor. Artillery, in particular, became central to Soviet strategy. Soviet forces increased the use of sustained bombardment to weaken Finnish defenses before advancing. Heavy artillery concentrations targeted known positions, reducing the effectiveness of Finnish fortifications. This approach marked a departure from earlier reliance on frontal assaults. Winter equipment was improved. Troops received better clothing, skis, and camouflage. Training adapted to cold weather conditions. While these measures did not eliminate hardship, they reduced non-combat casualties. Logistical systems were reinforced. Supply routes were secured, and efforts were made to ensure consistent delivery of ammunition, food, and fuel. These improvements gradually enhanced operational effectiveness. The Red Army also learned to counter Finnish tactics. Road security was strengthened to prevent encirclement. Patrols and reconnaissance increased, limiting Finnish mobility. Larger formations were used to reduce vulnerability to Motti tactics. Despite adaptation, progress remained costly. Finnish resistance continued to inflict losses, and morale among Soviet troops was uneven. However, the cumulative effect of Soviet adjustments began to shift the balance. By early 1940, Soviet forces achieved greater cohesion and momentum. Breakthroughs along the Karelian Isthmus reflected improved coordination and overwhelming firepower. Finnish defenders, though still effective, faced increasing pressure. The Winter War became a lesson in modern warfare. It demonstrated that numerical superiority alone was insufficient. Adaptation, logistics, and environmental understanding were critical to success. For the Soviet Union, the war's lessons would influence military reforms in the years ahead. The Red Army's performance in Finland foreshadowed both vulnerabilities and potential for improvement. The cost of adaptation was measured in lives. The lessons were learned through failure, and the Red Army emerged changed by the frozen battlefields of Finland. By February 1940, the Winter War had reached a decisive phase. The prolonged conflict had exhausted Finland's limited resources, while the Soviet Union, despite heavy losses, retained the capacity to continue the offensive. The balance of power, which Finland had managed to offset through terrain, tactics, and determination, was beginning to tilt irreversibly. On the Karelian Isthmus, Soviet forces launched a renewed and concentrated assault. Massive artillery barrages preceded advances, systematically targeting Finnish positions. The scale of firepower surpassed anything seen earlier in the war. Continuous shelling degraded defensive structures and strained Finnish supply lines. Finnish units fought with resilience, but shortages became critical. Ammunition supplies dwindled, reinforcements were limited, and exhaustion set in among troops who had been fighting in extreme conditions for months. Casualties, though lower than Soviet losses, were increasingly difficult to replace. International assistance failed to materialize in decisive form. While volunteers and supplies arrived from abroad, they were insufficient to alter the strategic situation. Diplomatic efforts to secure broader intervention did not succeed. Finland remained isolated. Recognizing the deteriorating situation, Finnish leadership began exploring the possibility of peace. The primary objective was to preserve national independence, even at the cost of territorial concessions. Negotiations were initiated under difficult circumstances, as Soviet forces continued their advance. On March 12, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. The agreement brought an end to hostilities but imposed harsh terms on Finland. Significant territories were ceded to the Soviet Union, including much of the Karelian Isthmus, parts of eastern Karelia, and strategic islands in the Gulf of Finland. The city of Viipuri, Finland's second-largest urban center, was lost. Approximately 400,000 Finnish civilians were displaced as a result of territorial losses. These populations were resettled within Finland, creating long-term social and economic challenges. Despite these hardships, Finland retained its sovereignty and political system. The war officially ended on March 13, 1940. The silence that followed marked the conclusion of one of the most remarkable defensive struggles of the Second World War. Finland had resisted a vastly superior opponent for over 3 months. Casualty figures underscored the war's intensity. Soviet losses were estimated at tens of thousands killed, with many more wounded. Finnish losses, though significantly lower, represented a substantial portion of the nation's population. The Winter War reshaped international perceptions. Finland's performance earned widespread respect and sympathy. Conversely, the Red Army's difficulties raised questions about its effectiveness, influencing strategic calculations in Europe. For Finland, the end of the war was both a defeat and a survival. The nation had lost territory but preserved independence. The experience reinforced national unity and reshaped military doctrine. The conflict ended not with victory, but with necessity. It concluded when resistance could no longer be sustained. Yet it ended on Finland's terms, as a sovereign state. The Winter War left a legacy that extended far beyond the borders of Finland. Although the conflict lasted only 105 days, its consequences reshaped military doctrine, diplomatic relations, and national identities across Europe. The war's impact was measured not only in territory loss and lives taken, but also in lessons learned and perceptions altered. For Finland, the immediate aftermath was defined by loss and survival. The territorial concessions imposed by the Moscow Peace Treaty deprived the country of economically and strategically important regions. The loss of the Karelian Isthmus and the city of Apuri disrupted industry, agriculture, and transportation networks. Hundreds of thousands of displaced civilians required resettlement, placing immense strain on the nation's resources. Yet Finland remained independent. This outcome was widely regarded as a remarkable achievement given the disparity in power between the combatants. The preservation of sovereignty became central to Finnish national memory. The Winter War was framed not as a defeat, but as a demonstration of resilience and unity. Militarily, the conflict prompted significant reassessment. Finnish forces analyzed their successes and shortcomings, refining doctrines that emphasize mobility, decentralized command, and adaptation to terrain. These lessons would influence Finland's military planning in subsequent years. For the Soviet Union, the Winter War exposed serious deficiencies within the Red Army. Poor coordination, inadequate training, and insufficient preparation for winter warfare had contributed to heavy losses. These failures attracted international attention and challenged assumptions about Soviet military strength. The Soviet leadership responded by implementing reforms. Training programs were revised, equipment standards improved, and command structures adjusted. The experience gained in Finland informed Soviet military operations later in the Second World War. Internationally, the Winter War altered strategic perceptions. Observers noted that a smaller nation, employing effective tactics and leveraging environment, could resist a much larger force. This realization influenced calculations by other states confronting major powers. The conflict also affected diplomatic alignments. Sympathy for Finland was widespread, though practical support remained limited. The war underscored the limitations of international institutions in preventing aggression, reinforcing skepticism about collective security mechanisms. Historically, the Winter War occupies a distinct place. It is remembered as a conflict where environment, preparation, and morale played decisive roles. The war challenged narratives of inevitable dominance by great powers and highlighted the importance of adaptability. The human cost of the war remained a central element of its legacy. Casualties, displacement, and psychological trauma affected generations. Commemoration focused on sacrifice and endurance rather than triumph. In Finland, the Winter War became a foundational narrative. It reinforced national cohesion and shaped identity. Annual remembrances and historical scholarship kept the memory alive, ensuring that lessons were not forgotten. The Winter War did not end conflict in the region. Its consequences influenced subsequent events, including Finland's later involvement in the Continuation War. However, the winter of 1939 to 1940 remained a defining moment. The legacy of the Winter War is not one of conquest or domination. It is a story of limits, of what power can and cannot achieve, and of how determination and environment can alter the course of history. The war ended in compromise. Its lessons endured, and its memory remained frozen in the forests and fields where it was fought.